Stephanie White told them to go get her. Stephanie White told them to go get Natasha Howard. Stephanie White wanted Bree Turner and all of this stuff. We don't need none of that this year. None of it.
Let's address what everyone is thinking, but the Indiana Fever front office doesn't want discussed. This roster situation is not an accident. It is not bad luck. It is not a product of an unforeseen market. It is the direct result of a series of decisions made by a coaching staff and front office that had every opportunity to get this right and chose a different path. And the evidence is already pointing in the same direction it pointed 12 months ago. The pattern is there for anyone who is willing to look at it honestly. Last offseason, Stephanie White and this front office assembled a supporting cast around the most talked about rookie in women's basketball history. They had resources. They had leverage. They had a player whose name alone was driving viewership numbers the league hadn't seen before. And the roster they put around her featured a player who was already planning her exit before training camp was over. A player who came into the building talking about winning MVP on someone else's team, and a collection of veteran names that had far more to do with Stephanie White's personal network than with what Caitlyn Clark actually needed to succeed. That is not speculation. That is what happened. And the question that nobody at the Indiana Fever wants to answer right now is this: what has actually changed? If you've been watching this channel, you already know the answer. And if you're new here, you need to understand something before we go any further. The warning signs that existed before last season are not gone. They have been repackaged. They are wearing a different label. But the underlying problem, a head coach who builds rosters around personal comfort instead of around her star player's strengths, that problem has not been addressed publicly, has not been acknowledged honestly, and has not been corrected in any way that gives this fan base a reason to feel confident about what comes next. If this is the analysis you've been looking for, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We are not done pulling this thread. Let's start with DeWanna Bonner, because that situation deserves to be examined with clear eyes, not just dismissed as a bad signing that didn't work out. What happened with DeWanna Bonner was not a miscalculation. It was a fundamental failure of evaluation at the organizational level. A player came into this building, collected a max contract, positioned herself publicly as a veteran leader and mentor for Caitlyn Clark, and was simultaneously planning to play somewhere else. That is not a player problem. That is an intelligence failure. That is a front office that either did not do its homework or did its homework and ignored what the homework said.
She signed for a max deal, got all she can get, left and collected the rest in Phoenix, which is what she wanted to do the whole time. She wanted to go play with Alyssa Thomas. She scammed the team, did us dirty, was pretending to be this OG leader for Caitlyn Clark and all of this stuff. It was all cap. It was lies. It was deceitful. It was ridiculous, and she stunk it up while she was here.
Now, here is the part that should concern every Fever fan looking ahead to this offseason. That decision. The decision to bring in DeWanna Bonner, to give her that contract, to sell her to the fan base as the experienced voice that would help guide a generational rookie. That decision came from somewhere. It came from a coaching staff that valued familiarity over fit, that valued a name they knew over a player whose game actually complemented what Caitlyn Clark does. And the question that nobody at the Indiana Fever has answered is whether that tendency, that instinct toward the comfortable and the familiar, has been corrected. Because there is no public evidence that it has. Then there is Natasha Howard. And this situation is revealing in a different way. Because the DeWanna Bonner situation was about a player who deceived the organization, the Natasha Howard situation was about an organization that deceived itself. When a player walks into your building talking about winning MVP on a team that already has its star, that player has been told something. She has been sold a vision. She has been given a reason to believe that her individual ambitions and the team structure are compatible. And that conversation happened with the coaching staff.
Stephanie White is the reason Natasha Howard came here talking about, I would like to win MVP. Stephanie White is the reason that she was coming in here talking like that. Stephanie White gave her all of these hopes and promises and sold her something.
This is a part that gets overlooked in conversations about last season. The performance issues with Natasha Howard did not emerge from nowhere. They were the logical consequence of a player who was recruited with the wrong expectations. When you tell a player she can be a featured scorer on your team, and then ask her to be a role player who moves the ball quickly and gets out of the way, you have created a conflict before the season even starts. And that conflict showed up in the box score, in the possessions, in the moments where the ball died in her hands instead of...
We watched Natasha Howard come to this team, talk about winning MVP, get rebounds, refuse to pass the ball, and insisted on dribbling the ball up the floor herself.
That is not a player who arrived with bad intentions. That is a player who arrived with bad information. Information the coaching staff provided. And the fact that Stephanie White has not publicly addressed this, has not come out and acknowledged what went wrong in that recruiting process, is not a neutral choice. Silence from a head coach after a season that went the way last season went is a statement. It says the people making the decisions do not believe they made mistakes. And that is far more alarming than any bad signing on its own. Here's what's actually at stake heading into this offseason, and why the next 60 days might define Caitlyn Clark's next 3 years in Indiana. Stay with me.
We haven't heard Stephanie White utter a word about Natasha Howard. Now, I'm not taking her not uttering a word as she doesn't want her back. I'm not taking it as that. I don't trust her.
That is where this fan base is right now. Not reassured, not confident. Watching, waiting, hoping that what looks like the beginning of a repeat is actually something different. But hope is not a roster construction strategy. And the Indiana Fever are walking into the most consequential offseason in the history of this franchise without having given their fan base a single concrete reason to believe the approach has changed. Let's talk about what this offseason actually requires. Because the new collective bargaining agreement has fundamentally changed the financial landscape of this league, and the decisions Indiana makes in the next several months are going to have consequences that extend far beyond next season. Caitlyn Clark and Aaliyah Boston are both eligible for maximum contracts earlier than most people originally anticipated. That is a significant portion of the salary cap committed before you add a single supporting piece, which means every decision around the edges of this roster has to be right. There is no margin for a Natasha Howard. There is no margin for a DeWanna Bonner. There is no margin for a single contract that prioritizes a coaching staff's comfort over a team's competitive needs.
With this new CBA, with this salary cap situation, with Aaliyah Boston and Caitlyn Clark being eligible for max contracts earlier than you thought, you're going to have to work some magic with the cap to bring in quality players to fit around this.
Work some magic. That phrase matters, because what it is describing is not a routine offseason. It is describing a situation that requires genuine organizational creativity, strategic thinking, and a willingness to look beyond the obvious and comfortable options. It requires a front office that is doing real work, evaluating film, building relationships with agents and leagues overseas, identifying players whose games specifically complement what Caitlyn Clark does on the floor, players who move the ball, players who space the floor, players who understand their role before they walk through the door, not players who need to be talked down from MVP expectations after they arrive. And here's a specific area where the Indiana Fever have a genuine opportunity that they have shown almost no interest in pursuing. The minimum salary structure in the new CBA has created a pipeline for international talent that smart franchises are already starting to exploit. Under the new exception, a team can sign a player at the fourth service tier and have it count only $277,000 against the cap. What that means in practice is that experienced professional players who have been competing overseas, players with years of pro experience, players who understand team basketball, players who have been trained in systems that emphasize ball movement and role definition, those players can come to the WNBA for a minimum deal and actually earn more than they were making in European leagues.
You're going to have to step up your overseas recruiting. You're going to have to step up your overseas scouting, okay? Because you can go overseas and find a quality backup point guard from overseas that will come and be the backup point guard for Caitlyn Clark for a minimum contract.
A quality backup point guard for Caitlyn Clark on a minimum contract. Here's why that single move could change everything about how this team functions. and why Indiana hasn't done it yet. Think about what last season looked like when Caitlyn Clark came off the floor. Think about what happened to the offense the moment she sat down. Think about how many possessions turned into isolation. Basketball. How many defensive sequences broke down. How many opportunities to extend leads evaporated because the player running the second unit was not equipped to run it the way this team needed. Now imagine that role filled by a player who has spent 5 or 6 years playing professional basketball in a system that emphasizes movement, spacing, and decision-making. A player who is not coming in with an agenda, who is not counting her personal stats, who is there to do one specific job and knows exactly how to do it. That player exists. She is probably playing in Europe right now. She is probably earning a fraction of what a WNBA minimum pays, and she would transform Indiana's second unit. But finding her requires scouting. Real scouting. Not phone calls to former teammates. Not recycling names that Stephanie White is already familiar with. Actual investment in identifying the right fit regardless of where that fit is located or whether anyone in the building has a prior relationship with her.
There's going to be quality players that are overseas that have pro experience that you can bring over to the United States and the WNBA to sign a Tier 1 WNBA minimum contract, and they can be quality rotational backup players. You're going to have to do these type of things to work around the cap. But the Indiana Fever, they're going to have to step their game up when it comes to scouting overseas.
You're going to have to do these things. That is not optional. That is not a suggestion. With Clark and Boston on max contracts, with Kelsey Mitchell commanding her own significant deal, the Fever do not have the luxury of filling out the roster the way they filled it out last year. They cannot sign expensive veterans who are a poor fit and hope the talent differential carries them through. The math does not allow it. The cap does not allow it. And frankly, the fan base should not allow it either. Here is a question nobody at the Indiana Fever wants to answer. If this front office builds another roster around Stephanie White's personal network instead of around Caitlyn Clark's actual needs, who is accountable for that? Because last season, accountability was diffuse. It was spread across players, across circumstances, across a WNBA schedule that asked a lot of a young roster. Next season, the circumstances will be different. The CBA is new. The information about what this team needs is clear. The blueprint exists. If the Fever walk into 2025 having made the same categories of mistakes, overpaying for the wrong veterans, ignoring the international market, failing to recruit specifically for fit, that is not bad luck. That is a choice. And the most uncomfortable part of this entire conversation is that the person with the most power to prevent it from happening again has not given any public indication that she understands what went wrong. Here's exactly what that tells us. Stephanie White is not a bad basketball coach. That is not what this is about. She has a track record. She has won at various levels. She understands the game. But understanding the game and building a roster around a player whose style demands a very specific kind of support are two different skills. And the evidence from last season suggests that when those two things come into conflict, when what Caitlyn Clark needs and what Stephanie White is comfortable with are not the same thing. The wrong side of that conflict has been winning. The DeWanna Bonner recruitment was about Stephanie White's comfort with a known name. The Natasha Howard recruitment was about Stephanie White's confidence that she could mold a player into something that player was not. The overall roster construction was about a coaching staff building the team it wanted to coach rather than the team its best player needed around her. And the results were what they were.
Stephanie White told them to go get her. Stephanie White told them to go get Natasha Howard. Stephanie White wanted Bree Turner and all of this stuff. We don't need none of that this year. None of it.
None of it is acceptable. And the reason none of it is acceptable is not because those players are bad people or because Stephanie White has bad intentions. The reason it is not acceptable is because Caitlyn Clark is too important to this franchise, to this league, to the growth of women's basketball, to spend her prime years operating in a system that is not built around her strengths. The fans who showed up last season showed up for her. The viewership numbers that this league is celebrating right now exist because of her. And the people running the Indiana Fever have a responsibility to that audience and to that player that goes beyond personal preference and coaching comfort. Look at what happens when Caitlyn Clark has the ball in her hands with space to operate. Look at her assist numbers. Look at her plus-minus in games where she plays extended minutes and the offense runs through her. Then look at what happens when the roster construction forces her into a reduced role, when the players around her are not moving without the ball, when the spacing is wrong, when the decision-making of her teammates slows the game down instead of letting her push the pace. The difference is not subtle. It is documented, and it points directly at what this team needs to do differently. The blueprint is not complicated. The question is whether the people running this franchise are willing to follow it. Because the consequences of getting this wrong a second time are bigger than anyone in that building seems to be acknowledging. The consequences extend beyond wins and losses. They extend into the relationship between this franchise and the fan base that came to women's basketball because of Caitlyn Clark. Those fans are not a permanent fixture. They are not guaranteed to stay engaged if the product on the floor continues to waste the talent they showed up to watch. Viewership does not sustain itself on potential and promises. It sustains itself on performance, and performance requires the right roster.
I believe that the Indiana Fever are in great danger of making some of the same mistakes because I do not feel like I trust this head coach or this front office.
That is the position this front office has put its fan base in. Not a position of confidence, not a position of excitement about what is coming. A position of genuine concern that the people responsible for surrounding one of the most talented players in the history of this league are going to walk into another offseason and make decisions based on the wrong criteria, based on familiarity instead of fit, based on personal relationships instead of basketball logic, based on what is comfortable instead of what is correct. And the uncomfortable truth that nobody at the Indiana Fever wants to say out loud is this: the margin for error is gone. It was thin last season. It does not exist this season. When you are paying two players maximum contracts and trying to build a championship-caliber roster around them on a constrained cap, every single decision matters. The fifth roster spot matters as much as the second. The player you sign to a minimum deal on the last day of free agency matters. The international scouting investment you make in January that nobody notices until training camp matters. Everything matters. And a front office that built what it built last season has not demonstrated that it understands how much everything matters. Here is what actually needs to happen. The Indiana Fever need to go into this offseason with one question driving every single roster decision. Does this player make Caitlyn Clark better? Not does this player have a good reputation. Not does this player have a prior relationship with the coaching staff. Not does this player fit the veteran leadership narrative we want to sell to the media. Does this player make Caitlyn Clark better? Does her game complement what Clark does? Does she move without the ball? Does she make decisions quickly? Does she space the floor in ways that open up the driving lanes and passing angles that Clark uses to devastate defenses? If the answer is yes, you pursue her. If the answer is no, you move on, regardless of how comfortable she makes the coaching staff feel. That is not a complicated standard. It is a straightforward one. But last season, this organization demonstrated that it is capable of convincing itself that players who fail that standard actually meet it. That is the real danger heading into this offseason. Not that the front office will make bad decisions maliciously, that it will make bad decisions while genuinely believing it is doing the right thing. Because that is what happened with DeWanna Bonner. That is what happened with Natasha Howard. Nobody in that building thought those were mistakes when they made them. They thought they were building something, and they were wrong. So the question for you is this: looking at everything this front office has done and not done, everything it has said, not said since last season ended, do you believe the Indiana Fever are going to get this right? Do you believe Stephanie White and this front office have done the internal work necessary to make different decisions this time? Or do you see the same patterns emerging that were visible 12 months ago, before the season started, before the mistakes were made, before the damage was done? Drop your answer in the comments, because this offseason is already underway, and the decisions being made right now are going to determine whether Caitlyn Clark spends next season in a system built for her, or in a system built around the preferences of the people coaching her. And that distinction is the difference between a franchise on the rise and a franchise squandering exactly the kind of opportunity that does not come around twice.